enough now. Right, which is a way to say welcome to the seminar at this very busy time of the year. It's very nice to be able to talk about some research that some of it I've done actually a long time ago, so I may not remember all of it, but I never had a chance to actually talk about it. And I put all those names there not to show off. It's of course to acknowledge my collaborators, but it's also because to remind myself that this that I'm trying to sell as a project is actually pieces taken from other bits. So I'm going to try to create a story, and I'm going to convince you that there's a story in a thread, but in reality I'll basically twist them together a little bit afterwards. So hopefully it makes sense. If not, just raise your hand and let me know, and I'll ignore you very happily. So today I also cheated you into this talk by telling you that it's about risk preference, when actually it's not really risk in general. It's specifically about financial risk. So I forgot that it was going to be a bit of a long title, I think. But we're going to be having a bit discussion about risk in general to start with, and then we're going to move on to financial risk. So what are we going to do is try to see whether this works. It works, great. So first of all, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about financial risk preferences, whether they're stable or not, and we're going to start very broad about preferences in general. And then I'm going to move on after a relatively long introduction to introduce you to the study and to the kind of literature, to 3 different studies that I managed to label in a way that I cannot even remember, because they are basically the same word scrambled here and there. But they all kind of have the same idea that context matters. And just to give away the answer of this talk, financial risk preferences we put forward are not stable. They are very much easily influenced by a bunch of things that we're going to go through in the slides. Right, so let's start by talking about preferences, about whether we know what we like. And the idea, you think about it, and I've got some students smiling because they've seen this slide. I used it with my student. And I'm hoping also that nobody here is from Bournemouth. Is there somebody from Bournemouth? No? Excellent, great. I have nothing against Bournemouth, not at all. I think you do agree, though, on the categorization of the different holidays. And actually, I've been to Bournemouth myself, and I really like it. It's great for kids as well. But this study is about preferences, whether we like and we know what we like. And the idea is that we think we do. I like a specific fruit over another fruit. I prefer bananas to oranges. And so you're not going to fool me, because whenever you ask me something, I know my preferences, I know what I like over what I don't like, or I prefer less. That's the point. So this study was run in 1993 by Richard Shafir, and in a study about reason-based choice, and people were offered 2 very different items. Now, of course, this was all hypothetical, so people were not actually paid to go on holiday, which is, for economists, is a bit of a problem. But then there were 2 different items, there were many pairs, and one of the pair was about an holiday which was very exciting and exotic, and the other one which was a bit more ordinary, but of course it was cheaper. Now, what the authors did, between subject, within subject, in all different sources, is to ask them a bunch of questions to reveal the preference in this kind of simple task. So the first question is, which one would you choose? And I'm simplifying a little bit to say that most people chose Bali. And it's not maybe a surprise to you, because Bali is exciting. So people said, yeah, I like Bali. I would like to go Bali. The majority of them. Now, of course, this is the trick, is that questions were changed, and there was a lot going on. And after a bit, people were asked which one they would reject. And now suddenly, preferences turned on their heads. And suddenly people reject Bali because they think, oh, it's a bit too expensive. So this kind of very simple finding kind of tells you that just by the way I'm asking you questions, I can actually make you flip your preferences very easily, okay? And there's something even more disturbing about our awareness of what we like and why. Now, this is a bit of a task that's been introduced in Science, 2005, where people are given, again, a pair of stimuli. It's been done with many different things, including jam in real supermarkets, so you may have been tricked there. And you've got, again, it's been done with all genders, ethnicities, and all of that. But in this specific case, there are 2 women, and people just need to point to the women they prefer. These participants prefer the women with darker hair. But then, of course, the psychologist is a bit of a magician, and there's a second card, so that when the card is revealed, the participants as actually being presented with a picture that he did not choose. And the striking finding is about 30 to 35% of participants do not even notice the switch. And most importantly is that they can actually come up with very strong reasons why they chose a stimulus that they actually did not prefer in the first place. And this tells us a little bit about the awareness of why we select things and how much actually can happen post-hoc in order to rationalize and to make sense of choices we made that should have been informed by our preferences, but it seems to be they've been maybe influenced by something a bit more volatile and something a bit more contextual and time limited. Now, of course, I'm presenting just a finding, so I need to have an enemy. These are psychologists, so our friends, so we need some enemies, and we're going to talk about them and the other economists, because they have a bit of a different view. But before we go there, I would like to ask you whether you think you're a risk-seeking person or are you a risk-averse person? Now, this is probably not an easy question, and you don't need to answer. But by the way, just in case, I was trying to see whether there's any reaction. In case you're wondering, this is a risk-seeking person. And in case you're wondering, this is a risk-averse. This is a little rabbit. However, if you've seen the film, which is the Holy Grail, the Monty Python, have you seen it? It's a fantastic film. Yeah, you haven't seen it. Sorry, different generation. And you will see that actually they are risk-seeking as well. But I'll just give that away. So when we think about ourselves, and I've done this with a colleague of mine recently, we can come up very quickly and easily to say, yeah, I tend to be risk-averse. For example, myself, I tend to be risk-averse. I'm trying to plan things ahead. I don't like last-minute surprises. I'm a bit over-conscientious sometimes because I don't like risk in a way. I don't want the probability of not being ready or not liking something. However, the story, I kind of gave it away already a little bit, is that things can actually be making us swing in one way or the other. But in the financial risk domain, and this is where we're going to be zooming in a little bit, we know that the kind of assumption is that people do have stable personalities. And in fact, and this happens, for example, if you go to a bank and you're going to go to open an investment portfolio, you're going to be assessed with a bunch of questions about your risk personality. And you're going to be characterized along a continuum depending on your answers. And depending on your answers, you're going to be offered some products rather than other products. Because the idea is to maximize kind of your income based on the level of risk that you're able to tolerate. So the idea here is that they ask you a bunch of questions, the agent choose a couple of things, and then they say, well, that's your risk personality. You're 2 out of 10, you're 8 out of 10, okay? And that's it. And we have a few problems with that. Right, so the assumption, just to repeat myself, and we're going to be talking about some of the models, is that people have stable risk personalities when we talk about financial decision making. And there are normative models that kind of say describe how we should be taking decisions, and of course we've got descriptive models that say how we actually doing them, but they have got common ground to say that actually people have common pattern of risk preferences, and they are finding to kind of suggest that this is the case as well. And we're going to be talking about one of the most famous theories in this field in a minute or so. So for example, and I take example, this is a bit more modern as an example, I don't know if you've seen, this is Rod Gilbert, he's handling a luggage, but of course luggage is missing, so we're talking about luggage insurance here. It's a very nice sketch and a lot of fun. And the idea is that when people have to decide whether to insure their luggage because there's 1% chance that the luggage, which is £500 worth, is going to be destroyed, like in that case, this kind of decision of taking insurance or not, and the insurance costs £5, so there's a cost and a benefit, of course, is that it's exactly identical, according to this theory, is to play a gamble where you can either pay £5 and nothing happens, or you take a gamble, and in this gamble you've got a 1% chance of losing £500. So you've seen what they've done there is that the values are the same. Your cost, which is £5, the chance of something terrible happening, and the impact of the terrible thing happening. Whether it's a gamble with some sort of a spinner, or whether it's a real company when you're flying, does not matter, because these are the numbers, and these are the kind of trade-offs that people do. Now, we already know, not from financial risk, I'm zooming out a little bit more, that this is not always the case, right? So for example, risk arises in very different domains, and I mentioned some there, and people may have different strategies when they approach risk depending on the domain, depending on the context, depending on what the decision is about. And that's why I think you were a little bit pensive when I asked you whether you're a risk seeker, because you were trying to think about all the kind of domains, and you think that you may be a risk seeker in one domain and risk averse in the other domain. And that's absolutely fine. That's what has been found. So for example, people have different strategies when they need to take decision in one domain to the other. They may want to maximize benefit. They want to limit the possibility of having little gain. So there are very different heuristics they could be using just depending on the domain. And so the idea is that they conceptualize risk differently depending on the setting, on the context, on the domain. Okay? So for example, evidence already from the late 80s shows that somebody can be risk averse for nuclear waste. They are not really for it, but they can be more risk seeking for issues that are related to their health. So there's already evidence that risk personality is not as stable as we are told. And then more recently, Elke Weber and collaborators devised one of the first actually the first and only validated questionnaire that measured these domain effects, where people asked a bunch of questions about the perceived risk, the perceived benefit, the attitude to risk in general, in 5 different areas such as health-related decision-making, social, ethical, financial. And what they found is that there's really domain specificity. So you could be very high in terms of risk tolerance in one domain, but low in the other one. So there's evidence when we talk about risk in life, social life, how you behave with friends, whether you do bungee jumping, whether you go canoeing in very fast rivers, but can be very different from when you decide whether to take a specific financial product or not. So what about financial risk? And I can zoom in again, and I think I will stick to this now. The idea, as I say, is that in classical decision theories, and we've got theories all the way from the 40s, utility theory, subjective utility theory, expected utility theory, the idea is that people do have a stable pattern of preferences that is dominated and is dictated by a value function. And I will show you something in a minute. This value function is called the utility function. Okay? And this utility function that determines your choices and your preferences. And it's because it's a function that is stable within you, therefore your risk preferences are going to be the same. So how do we measure financial risk preferences? How do economists and psychologists do that? Well, they can ask people, so they can ask them to do a bunch of psychometric questionnaires in relation to financial products, but most of the times they are revealed, which means that you ask them to kind of choose things, and then based on the choice data, you're going to be extracting numbers that characterize the utility function, which I'll show you in a minute. These are usually incentive-compatible experiments because you need to motivate people to make these choices as appropriately and accurately as possible. Otherwise, economists will not believe you because hypothetical scenarios they are not really convinced about. So, a few terms, because I said a few things without maybe describing them, so let me make sure that I say these things. The first one is the utility. I talked about utility, and I think you have an understanding of it, but it's very simply determined as how good or bad something happened to you. Okay? So it's the goodness of gaining something, winning something, and how bad it makes you feel to lose something. Then we have utility function, and all it does is that it describes the relationship, and I'll show you the most famous graph on utility function, that association objective values, so for example, winning specific amount of money, objective, you can measure it, an increase in percentage in your salary, anything that is measurable, and subjective values, how happy you are about it, how think it's good, okay, or how disappointed you are. And then, of course, the utility function gives you parameters, for example, gamma, which kind of describe how curved the thing is, and I'll show you in a minute. Now, we have a reference point as well, because, of course, you win something and you lose something, so you start from somewhere, and where you start really makes a difference. So if you are a billionaire, or if you have a very low salary, well, clearly that makes a difference. So you need to keep in consideration where you're starting from. And that's called the reference point. And then, of course, we've got the risk preferences, and you can be labeled as risk-seeking. So, for example, if you've got an option between one safe choice, which you know exactly what's going to happen, and one which is probable, but you've got the probability of being disappointed or being very happy because you've got a high return. If you choose the one that is probable, it's a risk-seeking choice. If you choose the safe option because you know what's going to happen, it's predictable, you're going to be characterized as risk-averse. So that makes sense, right? It's quite intuitive. Right, so let me tell you about the theory of everything. Now, if you have a paper and you've got the number of citations, it would be very nice. I would just check them a week ago. It's over 47,000 citations. This comes all the way from 1979, has been refined in 1992. It's called prospect theory, and I think you're all familiar with it, especially my students. But it's the theory of everything, and it can explain all sorts of things from the endowment effect, the status quo bias, all sorts of things. And the only thing it does, very quickly, is that describe the association that I just told you. So what it does, based on, of course, empirical evidence and postulation of mathematical functions, what it does is just it maps the objective with the subjective. Simple as that. And this is a revealed pattern of preferences that are stable across people. Okay, so this is the theory of everything. So it's an implicit function that relates the objective, which is, so you're here and you win £1, so you move there, or you're here and you lose £1 and you go there. And then you need to map it to how unhappy you are or to how happy you are. Now I'm going to show you one hypothetical function, which is the function that would say we are exactly rational. We value things exactly as they are. And this is, very quickly, it's a very linear function that would say when you win, I'm making very simple examples, you win £1, you're happy 1, you win £2, you're happy 2. Again, from your reference point, right? And then you lose £1, you're unhappy 1, and then you lose £2, you're unhappy 2. Now, of course, I showed you this in a dashed line, so you know that's not what's going to happen. And this is exactly what happens when people are offered gambles. And this has been replicated across age, across ethnicities, across. It's this fellow function that is being replicated over and over and over in this kind of gamble task. Okay? So people are presented with gambles, and then with the choice data that we have, then you can calculate this utility function. And this one, just to, again, I will extrapolate just the very simple things that this thing is telling us. It's telling us first that we're a little bit irrational, and secondly that we're a little bit asymmetrical as well. That's fine. So the first thing you notice is that this is not a linear relationship, and what you see is that it's a little bit of a logarithmic. It kind of goes up and then kind of becomes a plateau. And what it tells us is the phenomenon of diminishing sensitivity. That winning money gives you a lot of pleasure when it departs from your reference point, whatever that is, but then slowly you tend to be less sensitive to additional gain. So winning much more does not give you as much happiness than winning something that moves you away from your reference point. And the other thing that we talked about was the asymmetry, which means that you can see, I actually exaggerated, it's not so bad, but if you take these two parameters, it's about 2.2 something, so it's twice as convex, so this is, concave, this is convex. And what it tells you is that this is a little bit steeper, right? So when you lose £1, there it is, you lose a lot of happiness. So you're very unhappy, unhappy 3. But when you win £1, your happiness is just, let's say, 1.5. Okay? So you're much more affected by negative things happening to you. You're much more affected by losing something compared to winning something. And this is called loss aversion, and you heard about it in all different stories, and kind of predict match behavior like the one I mentioned before. Okay, so by the way, just for interest again, and then I'm sure I'm not using any more slides for the lecture, but it's too tempting not to put it here. This is the kind of the relationship you get between money and happiness. When people ask you whether more money makes you happier, now you know that that's exactly what happens. Okay, and so what this graph is telling you, this is from the US 1994, but it's been replicated in Japan, in other non-Western countries. It's been replicated at the individual level. It's been replicated at the country level. So you've got all different stories that kind of say that there's the same association. And what it kind of says is that when you're poor, you're really affected by lack of money. So gaining gives you, kind of protects you and increases your happiness steadily. So there's a very steep relationship between gaining money and your satisfaction and your well-being. But then the more you gain money, as I say, the less you become sensitive to it. So gaining much more money does not increase you as much the happiness that you expect from it, sort of thing. Right, so back to prospect theory, theory of everything. These are two examples that kind of explain the framing effect, like the one I showed you before in a different version, of course. People are given £1, and then they can either choose the safe option, another 500, or they can flip the coin, and you either get 0 or an extra £1,000. And then in the second scenario, people would start with £2,000, and then they can lose £500 for sure. This is the safe option, or they can go for the risky option where if they're lucky, they lose nothing. If they're lucky, they lose £1,000. Okay? And what you find, and this is again framing effect very strongly, predicted very clearly from what I showed you before from prospect theory, is that people flip. And so when you're in the domain of gain, you tend to be risk averse because you go for the safe bet, and when you're in the loss domain, you tend to be risk seeking, and you tend to go for the flip coin. And this is again the data in percentages, the percentage of choice, which is a massive difference. There are really big differences in the way we decide and take decisions depending on them being rated as gain or losses. And by the way, this theory worded him and his collaborator passed away by the time, which was Alan Tversky, the Nobel Prize, one of two from psychologists, by the way, so that's what you aspire to. They both cram is given for economics, but he's a psychologist, and the other one is Richard Thaler, again, is somebody who works between psychology and economics, so they seem to pay a lot of attention to this kind of work. And as what I wanted to point out, by the way, that in terms of actual wealth, the two scenarios are exactly the same, and that's of course interesting because we are not sensitive to numbers in the way that we should be if we are rational, because we should just see what kind of is the outcome for us, but actually the way it's framed makes an impact. Okay, so this is prospect theory. So now this was the earlier version, and then something happened to say, well, it's not just about the values, also about the probabilities. I'm making it a bit more complicated just to tell you that we've done the work and that we start from there. And what they do is that, well, what about probability? So you told about the £10 and you distort it a bit, depending on where you start from. What about if I give you 30%? How does that psychologically feel for you? And again, data from gambles, and the gambles tells us that, again, we're not rational. So again, we can map very quickly the objective probabilities, what people are told, and this is how they feel, how they are interpreted, based on the choice data of what they've done economically in gamble sets, and this is what you get. Now, if you're rational, you take the numbers for what they are, so again, you have a linear function, yeah? But what happens, and this you kind of understand it quite quickly, is that with low probabilities, we tend to overestimate them a little bit, and when we go for the larger probabilities, we tend to underestimate them. Unless, of course, we go for certainty, we understand certainty, we think about it as 100%. When we are told about 0, we think about 0%. But as soon as we're told 10%, we tend to consider it a bit more than it actually is, and when we're told, let's say, 70%, it feels much less certain than it is. So we distort also the probabilities. So we distort the numbers that we are told in terms of value, and then we distort also the probabilities. And this, all together, all combined, gives us, again, a stable pattern, though, because even if we're rational and we distort things, we do it always the same way. Yeah? And so the pattern is not just about being risk-seeking for losses and risk-averse for gain. It depends on the level of probability that's associated with it. So you've got the famous four-fold pattern. So for example, with gains, if the probability of the risky option is high, then you're risk-averse, but you become risk-seeking if the probability of in the risky choice, it's low. And then it's the other way around for losses. So you actually have a kind of a reverse depending on the probability, because we underestimate them, overestimate them, and because we distort the values. But this is pattern, it's stable, yeah? It's found, and that's how our risk preferences are determined. Depending on our distortion, we're not rational, but we do it always the same way. And so by using gambles, we can predict exactly how people will be. Right. So we can predict risk according to these theories, depending on the choices that we make in binary gambles. And they're exactly like the one I showed you. You want £500 or we flip a coin. That kind of behavior predicts your risk preferences across, and this is the point, financial domain. Right. Now, we already have some evidence that this may not be true in terms of financial risk-taking. So, for example, when we have a comparison between insurance, which is basically buying yourself a feel of safety, that something that can happen, will not happen to you when you buy car insurance, and mathematically identical gambles of flipping a coin and losing £500 or not. people are more risk averse for insurances, even though the numbers are exactly the same. And this is because insurance is interpreted psychologically something different than just losing money, right? Or the possibility of losing money, sorry. And in fact, people see insurance as a bit of an investment more than just a risk reduction measure. And as a consequence, they're more likely to take it. So you're more likely to use insurance compared to being risk averse with just these gambles that we talked about. And also, what we have is that we start to have some evidence, and we will talk about it a little bit more detail in study 2, is that memory plays a role. And so even though the claim is that these value functions are exactly the same all the time, the claim is that actually memory can distort these value functions. And so because our memory is very malleable and it's influenced by context, then the value functions will change as well. And so our stability of preference is actually undermined. And accessibility, we know, the easier it is for you to remember something, the more it's going to affect your judgment. And the accessibility can change depending on your status, your situation, your environmental cues, and X, Y, Z. Okay, so what we're trying to ask is, can we really trust prospect theory, who's got 47,000 citations, and trying to undermine with our empirical work, but trying to say that maybe gambles, as flipping the coin and winning pounds or losing pounds, is enough to measure risk preferences across different domains? That's the first question. And the second one is related to the first one. I just said the first one. So how good are gambles to kind of mimic and predict the behavior in all the different financial domains? And do we get different domain effects as we get for recreational or social or health-related decision making? Okay, so first study, finally we got some data. This one is about domain as context, so we're just trying to see risk preferences and whether they're stable across different financial products. It's as simple as that. It's an exploratory study because it has not been done before, believe it or not. Okay? So we tried to frame similar gambles, and I'll give you a bit more details, as different products, and we say whether people take the same decisions, regardless of the domain, the context of the financial product. And the rationale is, of course, is to test whether risk personality is there, and if it's there, people will behave in the same way. And also to see whether maybe we should diversify the portfolio advice when people are told, well, you're risk averse. The question would be, well, it depends on what you're offering me. I could be risk averse for investment, and I could be risk seeking for insurance, for example. So we had 7 products because we took the one that we thought were the most used in everyday life, or as much as possible. So you got investment, insurance, I think you're familiar with this one, provide pension, job salary, and mortgage. And all we did was to frame these ones, so people had to make choices, so again it was reveal preference, and then we framed them. So this is the only manipulation that we had, excuse me, where we kind of told them, this is a lot of text and I actually can't remember it, but what it does is that it gives you some numbers there, and then it tells you that it's about pension. And so you can choose a pension which is a bit safer, so you have for sure, where was it, £30 per day, or you can choose a pension that is, there are other products in there, and what happens is got that probability of getting £100 a day, right? So it's again, it's a bit a gamble, as we've said, a safe option versus a risky option, but it's framed as pension. And then we've got similar numbers, and we've done it for the gambles, which is what we talked about before, which is what has been used before. And again, it's about the pie charts, and I'll tell you exactly the task. And then people is about, you know, again, £30 for certain, or 50% of winning £100. But this is about spinning and trying your luck as a gamble. Yeah? Okay. We also control for absolute wealth because we had different similar amounts across the scenarios. And so mathematically, the gambles were roughly the same across all the different domains. So the only thing that differed was just how they were packaged. Yeah? Okay. So we had 76 participants who were remunerated but not incentivized. And I'm happy I'm not presenting to economists, I hope. It was just not possible. We had a survey, so participants had to make choices in each domain. Let me see if I give you an option. Yeah. To make it a bit simpler, we didn't give too much numbers, but just in case, this is the case where you need to choose between £53 for certain in whatever domain it was, and this is the riskier option where we've got this probability of getting 100, which is, by the way, 80%, but then if that doesn't happen, you get 0, okay? So we simplified it in order to present probability as in a kind of a graphic way more than numerically. And And so the choice was between a sure outcome, this is called Y, and a probability, this bit, of getting this, which is X. And we have different probability levels that we match across different values for X. And then we created a value of Y depending on the curvature of the utility function. Yeah? So then we have values that would also push risk seekers sometimes to go for the safe option, and they would push also the risk averse to go sometimes for the riskier option. So you get as maximum diversity in performance as possible. Right. What did we do? We had randomization of these were questionnaires, it was paper-based, and we had the gamma levels, which is the level of risk-seeking of each choice, and then the presentation order, the combinations, we did things that we think are right, and the outcome was just a ratio of how many options you've chosen were risky in a specific domain. Okay, so if you've gone for the probabilistic, that's the risky one, and that we took that one as a 1, and then we get the proportion across the different domains. So the idea is that, of course, if your financial risk personality is the same, you get similar values across the domains, and most importantly, and that's what we're going to show you now, you get also very strong correlation, you should, between the domains. So what you have here is there, and I apologize for the zeros there, you've got the correlation coefficients in terms of risk proportions, proportion of risk options that you've chosen, across the different 7 domains. And what you find is that there are correlation, yes, and you can see them, but what you know from your knowledge of statistics is that it is actually very small to medium at the most. So then this is a bit of a problem already, because if your risk preferences are stable, you expect these numbers to be 0.5, 0.6, 0.8, to be strong correlation. And actually, the correlation are relatively low. Even though the numbers are the same, the task is the same, the only thing that changed was the packaging of the scenario. And we did something further. We tried to see whether there was a pattern there, to try to see whether there were different factors. So again, it was an exploratory study, so we run an exploratory principal component analysis, factor analysis, and what we did, after a couple of permutations, we found the optimal solution that explained about 70% of the variance, and you've got this clustering of products, pension gain and salary, that we label positive, because it's a plus, it's about the utility, and then you've got mortgage and investment, that we label as positive, but a bit more complex, financial products, and then we've got, of course, insurance and loss. This is about the prospect of losing something. This we call the negative factor. And this is a kind of a very strong solution, and what they also looked at, and we allowed for the factors to correlate, is that there's very little correlation between the negative and the 2 positive factors. We actually correlate strongly. Okay? So what these kind of results tell us is that people are very sensitive to the domain, and when presented with exactly the same numbers, they still respond differently because of the domain and the scenario that is offered to them. So their financial risk preferences are dependent on the domain, exactly like for social recreational activities and ethical decision making and the like. Okay? Now here we try to move to the second study by talking about accessibility, and so we speculate a little bit, is that, well, when you have gambles or when you have the product, you may have encountered these products or these experiences in the past, and so you rely also on your previous experience with this. And so you tap onto your memory traces of the experience, and so we try to see whether the experience of an event may leak into the decision you're making, even though the numbers are there specified for you. Just because you encountered a specific product in the past, you may act differently even though the numbers are provided to you. And this is about accessibility, and what we try to test in the second study, and where we try to further, this is of course speculative because we did not test experience, we did not test how often participants encountered each product and the like, how confident or how fluent they were in the products. It was an exploratory study. So in the second study we say, well, let's try to see whether we manipulate memory, and we find an effect in risk preferences. Okay? And if that's the case, then there will be, when people make a decision and they determine their risk preference, it's not just about the numbers that are there, but there's an integration also, which are the description of the values, but it's also about your experience. And that we label as accessibility memory. Okay, so case of insurance, we talked about how insurance is already being perceived slightly different from the gambles. So we used it because we know something about it. And again, if we talk about normative variance, well, gambles or insurance, gambles to lose and insurance are the same. Our point of view is that gambles are very essential. It's just about the percentage of losing something, while insurance also picks up on your semantic experience, your personal experience with the product, and may be associated with all sorts of bunch of things that is not associated with a gamble to lose. Now, does anyone remember or recognize, and students cannot answer because I think I used this one as well, maybe not. No, I didn't use this one, great. Do you recognize this film?
Truman Show.
Truman Show, yeah, this is great. So what they're doing here, by the way, the insurances, and we tend to be very risk averse, is because what they make is that they make very likely events much more, in our memory, in our decision making, much more likely than they actually are. And so people buy insurances more than they actually should. But of course, we can talk about it a bit later. Right, so we test the accessibility framework and try to understand how memory can contribute, and we actually use two different types of accessibility. The first one is that we know that there are some events, like being hit by a golf ball, which is very unlikely, but there's also something that is more likely, which is, for example, according to the sample, that people can steal stuff from cars or from offices. Yeah? So we bring in this knowledge about the frequency of events when we come up with a decision-making task. And also, and that's what we manipulated as well, it's the accessibility of the event just based on semantic activation, which we manipulate at the same time. So here we're talking about long-term beliefs about how frequent stuff happens in the world, and this is about something that we manipulated just before the task to kind of try to see whether the effects of these two different accessibilities is, how do you say, incremental or not. I'll give you an example because I think it's a bit obscure at the moment, but it makes sense later. Right? So accessibility of domain-specific events was manipulated independently about the beliefs about the frequencies. So let me just tell you what we did. We tested 90 participants. It was an online study. People were paid, but it was not incentivized. I need to say it. And again, it was a simple choice task between Y, a sure outcome, and the probability of X. And we had this kind of design, 3x2x9 mixed design. The three levels here between subject refer to semantic priming. And this is the immediate priming. There's a lot of levels on there. Unfortunately, we found no interactions. So you've got three levels for semantic priming, which is basically the kind of manipulating accessibility just as you're encountering the task. The one that I was telling you before, the environmental decision making that we are playing around with, not your long-term memory. And it could be either relevant, irrelevant, or you're not primed. So let me give you the example. We prime you to think about theft of personal belongings inside the car by asking you this very simple question, whether it's more likely in London or New York. Don't ask me which one is more likely because I've got no clue. But what we did is that we kind of primed them to think about this event, which is, by the way, relatively frequent, and then we give the kind of option of Y and P of X in the same domain. So there's a congruency between the priming, make you think about something, and the domain where you're making the risky and safe option, don't worry. And now we got also the not relevant, because you probably asked this question exactly, but before we ask you about, where is it, accident perhaps during leisure time in the population. So we prime you about something else, and then we ask you about people stealing stuff from your car. So the priming can be relevant, aligned, or non-relevant and non-aligned. The second bit, the second independent variable, which is again between subject, is the subjective frequency of beliefs. So there are some elements that people believe are more frequent and some events which are less frequent. And here we use normative data that was collected 8 years ago. So believe it or not, the ratings are not as extreme as we thought, but people think that stealing stuff from cars is more frequent than being hit by a golf ball. But we divided these events as frequent and infrequent, and so we expected, of course, that people in the high frequency case, even though they are told exactly the numbers, they still think they're more frequent, and so they're more risk averse because they want to protect themselves. And this is normative data that we picked up from the literature. And then, of course, we got the 9 mixed design where we got the 9 probabilities associated with the probabilistic outcome, the P of X. So the P has got these 9 levels here. Right. We got also into consideration about X, but it's not too important. Now again, the outcome, the dependent variable is the proportion this time, just to confuse a little bit and keep you awake, the proportion of risk-averse choices that you made. Yeah? So the higher the value now, the more risk-averse you are. And we use the certainty equivalent, which is the midpoint between the lowest accepted value and the highest rejected value. And then we look at the expected value, which is just P by X. And if the certainty equivalent is greater, then the choice is classified as risky, as done in the literature by James Fox. Right. What we find, and this is going to be a horrible table, but I'll see what I can do with it, and I have a graph a little bit, is that we find, as I said before, no interaction whatsoever, which means that these effects were independent of each other. We've got a moderate effect of the priming, which is just immediately after the environmental priming, where, of course, when the priming was relevant, people were more risk averse than when it was irrelevant or the control condition. We also have an effect that we knew was going to happen about the subjective frequency. So people, even though the numbers are the same, people were more risk averse for the events that they think are more likely to happen, like stuff being stolen in the car compared to the golf. And this, of course, we got the strong effect, which is I showed you before, that people, as the probabilities go up in the loss domain, people become more risk-seeking, and this is, of course, a very large effect. So there are small effects that add to the very large effect. So this is the table I showed you. Right. So here you have, for example, the proportion of safe choices is greater for high-frequency tasks compared to high-frequency events compared to low-frequency, even though the numbers are the same, right? People are exactly told the same numbers. And what you see here is that the total of relevant priming attracts more risk-averse choices than the low-frequency. And then, of course, you've got risk-seeking going up as probabilities go up, which I can show you in the last graph, which is a little bit more understanding, but I lose the information about the long-term effects, about high-frequency, low-frequency effects. What you've got is a very strong effect of probability associated with the probability outcome, but you also get people are more risk-averse in the relevant priming condition compared to the other two, which do not differ with each other. And most importantly, as we said before, even though it doesn't look like that, there's no significant interaction between them. So what it kind of says is that there are completely independent effects, and when you take a decision, even though the numbers are there, you still bring in your experience, your beliefs about high frequency, low frequency events, and you're still influenced by recent activation in the context, making you think about taxis in London or New York. Even though the numbers are all there and they're always the same, you go beyond it. You just don't trust the numbers. You bring in your own personal experience, even though the numbers were also not included in the semantic priming condition. It was just about making you think about stuff being stolen that made you more risk averse about it. And that's how, as I say, people pressure into buying financial things, financial insurance. So what these kind of findings say, in line with other previous research, is that when we think about risk preferences, it's not just about deliberate decision making, there's also experiential decision making that comes into context, and we call it pre-conscious, so something that is maybe slightly below your conscious awareness. And something else, of course, matters is feelings, and that's why we move to the third study, where we know already, for example, by priming you to be risk-seeking in a positive way compared to a negative way, can make you more risk-seeking compared to here. So people were provided, in this study in 2002, provided with different adjectives and were primed positively and became more risk-seeking, or negatively about risk-seeking, and so they became more risk-averse, or they were primed with negative words about risk avoidance, and so they become more risk-seeking, or they were actually primed with something positive associated with risk aversion, and they become even more risk-averse. So we know that definitely affect has got an impact, and I'm going to breeze through this one, but just the bottom line of all of this is that the findings are a little bit inconsistent. So sometimes negative effect can make you more, it increases the perceived risk, while the opposite is true for positive effect, which makes sense. This is the mood congruency hypothesis. When you're in a good state, you think about positive things and that affects your decision making. But then there are also problems because sometimes positive mood can also increase risk-averse behavior. So the relationship between affect and risk-seeking is complicated. And we make it so just to create the case for our context, which means that maybe it's because also the way in which affect impacts decision making is the way you're thinking about the context in a different way. So you could have gambles, which are very stripped of all the elements as we mentioned before. They're very simple. So you may be using something of more of a elementary kind of decision strategy compared to pension or investment, which are difficult decisions, and so you're engaging in system 2, which is the more effort for cognitive processing, and as a consequence you're more shielded by emotional effect. And sorry if I'm rushing it a little bit. But the idea, and again it's a little bit speculative, is that just because you're encountering different products, you use different strategies, and because of the different strategies, the emotional effect can be different depending on the domain that you're specifying. Okay, so what did we do? Let me remind myself. So we looked at whether priming people negatively is the same regardless of financial effect. And this is a bit the same story. It was an exploratory study. If we prime people negatively, is it going to be the same effect regardless of financial product? So we use negative priming because it just works better and elicits greater response and greater cognitive reaction. And we use something that's been done before, so we just printed some questionnaire on an empty background compared to a background with a negative picture in it, which I think it was just bad weather or a tornado coming up. And this is kind of normative data from the International Affective Pictorial System. So we prime people negatively, and then we change the task again. And what we did is that you were told about a specific thing, and then you were said, can you please pick which option you would like to pick. So it's a bit different. Instead of having the binary Y or P of X, you've got one which is of course the safe option, because regardless of how you flip the coin, you're going to get exactly the same outcome. Now here you have a different situation, because if something happens it's very good, but then you can end up by regretting it. And then of course this is the most risk-seeking option, because if this happens you get a lot, but you also have the risk of losing a lot. So this is more of a measure of risk aversion than risk-seeking, but it kind of tells you that as you move from 1 to 5, the more you pick 5, the more you're less risk-averse. Right. The domain is simple. Between subject, we got the priming, negative, or control, and then we got the 6 different domains. I forgot what they are. They're the same as before, apart from one. And what did we do? We tested 120 participants. We did all the sort of good things that you should do. And people had to make the same choices with the same numbers in the different domains as I showed you before. And as I said, option 5 was the less risk-averse. So it's an ordinal measure. The closer you are to 1, the more risk-averse. And the closer to 5, the less risk-averse you are. These are the results. I hope they're shown. First of all, we got problem with, of course, it's an ordinal measure. We got also the problem where we got the same outcomes even when we run parametric and non-parametric analysis. And what we get is that, yes, when you prime negatively, your risk-seeking behavior, your risk aversion, increases. But this is confined to two domains. And surprise, surprise, they are just confined significantly to loss and to win, which are the two gambles that are more abstract sort of domain compared to the other domains, which are more realistic, they're more engaging, they're more complex. So we said that yes, negative priming led to more risk aversion, but this was a domain-specific effect. And so it could be, and a little bit speculative because we didn't measure this either, but it's a suggestion for future research to see maybe it's because of the kind of decision that people used when they were approaching the different domains. Okay. So, main points, just to bring a home message, and I've finished just in time. Very happy. Sorry, not a lot of time for question. The idea is that we're not our risk preferences, they are not stable. Context matters, affect matters, and also the strategies maybe that we use, they do influence our internal utility function to a large extent. Maybe using gambles is not a very good idea in different domains because we bring emotional, experiential baggage with the different financial products, even though we may not be financial experts. And lastly, memory does indeed influence risk preferences, and memory is malleable and it's volatile, and so our risk preferences can be. That's it. Thank you very much. Sorry.